Elias did not measure time in days, but in the rotations of light. Each complete revolution of the great beam across the dark waters was a cycle, a mechanical breath that kept him alive, but not truly living. For 20 years he had been the keeper of the solitary point lighthouse, but in truth he was a prisoner of a silence he had imposed upon himself. His movements were a ritual of obsessive precision. At 5 in the morning the gears were greased. By 6, the brass of the handrails was polished until it reflected a face he no longer recognized. The stone floor, swept 3 times a day, held not a single grain of dust. Order was his religion, the only gospel he had left. Keeping the chaos outside was the only way to prevent the chaos within from consuming him entirely. But order was a facade that could not hide the man's ruin. His beard, long and unkempt, was threaded with salt and sorrow. His clothes, though clean, hung from a body that seemed to have shrunken in on itself. And his eyes were the emptiest part of the lighthouse. They were 2 windows facing an endless horizon, yet they saw nothing beyond a fixed memory, a point in time that refused to pass. He did not speak, for words had lost their meaning. Why speak when the only conversation that mattered was a constant echo in his mind, a question that would never be answered? Elias was the master of a kingdom of stone and light, an automaton driven by duty, a man who had given up on everything, especially himself. The past did not live in yellowed photographs or in bundled letters. For Elias, the past was a physical presence, a ghost that clung to objects. In his small, austere room, atop a perfectly tidy nightstand, rested a tiny wooden boat. It was no larger than his palm, with a miniature sail carved with childlike delicacy. Every night, before the darkness became absolute, Elias would pick up the small boat. His fingers, thick and calloused from work, would trace the worn curves of the wood with a reverence that was almost a prayer. And for a moment, the sound of the wind outside would transform into the sound of laughter, a crystal-clear laugh, full of sunshine and life. The lighthouse did not guard the secret. The sea was the one that kept it. The tragedy needed no name. It was in the way Elias looked at the waves, not with the respect of a sailor, but with the silent anger of a man betrayed. It was in the way he flinched whenever a gull cried out too close, as if the sound could shatter the fragile shell he lived in. He had exiled himself to that lighthouse not to serve the sea, but to watch over it, to punish it with his constant gaze. 20 years of staring at the same horizon, at the same stretch of water that had given him everything and then had taken it all away. That little wooden boat was not a memento, it was an anchor, a piece of wood that kept him permanently submerged in grief, unable to surface for air. For the ships lost in the night, the lighthouse was a promise of salvation, a beacon of light piercing the darkness, guiding them to safe harbor. For Elias, it was the embodiment of his penance. The stone tower, solid and unyielding, was the perfect refuge from a world he could no longer bear. Inside, there were no questions, no pitying glances, no sound of life happening without him. It was his fortress, his sanctuary of solitude. And yet, every step of the spiral staircase he climbed and descended each day was another link in the chain that bound him. The lighthouse that protected him from the world was the same one that prevented him from ever being a part of it again. The duality was cruel. The light he so dutifully projected was his greatest irony. It was a beam of hope for others, a lifeline cast across treacherous waters. Yet this same light cast the darkest shadow right at its base, in his own heart. He was the keeper of the light, but he lived in an inner darkness no lamp could ever reach. His mission was to show the way, but he himself was hopelessly lost. The lighthouse was not his home. It was his tomb and his testament. A monument to his guilt, a tower that pointed to the heavens but kept him chained to the earth, a voluntary prisoner serving a sentence he had given himself, to live forever at the site of his greatest failure. The storm did not arrive, it awakened. It began as a change in the sea's breath, a deeper, heavier rhythm that Elias felt in his very bones. The horizon, usually a sharp line dividing blue from blue, dissolved into a sickly gray smear. The wind ceased to be a solitary lullaby and became a howl, a lament that crept through the cracks of the stone tower, searching for him. Within hours, the sky gave way. The rain didn't fall, it was hurled horizontally, like spears of ice water lashing the thick glass of the lantern room. The waves, once a steady rhythm, became liquid monsters, rising in dark walls that crashed against the rocks with the force of demolition. The lighthouse, a pillar of stability for 20 years, now shuddered. Elias felt the vibration under his feet, a resonance that climbed his spine. The fury he kept locked inside, his anger at the sea, at fate, at himself, was now unleashed, made manifest in nature. The world outside had become a perfect mirror of his soul, a whirlwind of chaos, darkness, and purposeless violence. He carried on with his tasks, polishing the brass more fiercely, sweeping the floor more vigorously, in a futile attempt to impose his small order on the universe's anarchy. But this time, his refuge was not safe. The storm wasn't just battering from the outside, it was calling to something that lived within him. It was at the height of the fury, when the sound of the world had been reduced to a continuous roar, that Elias heard it. It was not a sound, but an interruption in the chaos. A knock. Faint, almost imperceptible, but rhythmic. Human. His first thought was that it was an illusion, a trick of the wind, a piece of driftwood being thrown against the door. He ignored it. But the knock came again, a little more desperate, a plea amid the deafening noise. Elias's heart, a slow and forgotten machine, gave a painful lurch. He approached the heavy oak door, the only entrance to his fortress. He peered through the small, thick glass peephole and, for a moment, saw nothing but a veil of rain and darkness. Then a shape materialized, a shadow, a huddled figure clinging to the doorframe as if for dear life. It was a woman. Her hair was plastered to her face, her clothes were a soaked rag, and even through the distorted glass, he could see the terror in her eyes. Her presence there was an impossibility, a defiance of all laws of logic and survival. No one could have reached that rocky island in this storm. It was a miracle or a portent. Reality, the outside world he had so long ago renounced, was not just knocking at his door, it was trying to break it down with the force of a castaway. Elias's instinct, honed by 2 decades of solitude, screamed a single word: no. That door was more than wood and iron. It was the boundary of his world, the membrane separating his controlled silence from the unbearable noise of humanity. To open that door would be to desecrate his sanctuary. It would be to let in chaos, unpredictability, pain. His hand moved to the lock, not to open it, but to check that it was secure. The woman outside represented everything he fled from: fragility, need, life itself. He had nothing to offer. The man who knew how to comfort, how to care, had died long ago in that very sea. But then a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, and for a fraction of a second he saw her face clearly. He saw a cut on her forehead, blood mixing with the rain. He saw her blue lips trembling. And he saw in her eyes not just fear, but an exhaustion so profound it was achingly familiar. It was the look of someone with no strength left to fight. And that look pierced through 20 years of rust and stone and touched something inside him, a memory of duty. Not the duty of a lighthouse keeper, but an older, more fundamental one, the duty of one human being to another. His hand wavered, trembling. The battle inside him raged more fiercely than the storm outside. Protect himself or save another. maintain his hollow peace, or face the complication of life. With a groan that was half curse, half surrender, he turned the lock. The door creaked open, and as he let the stranger in, Elias felt that it wasn't just wind and rain invading his lighthouse. It was the world, and he was making his first truly human decision in 20 years. There was an ocean of silence between them, vaster and more intimidating than the one roaring outside. Aurora sat in a wooden chair, huddled inside a coarse blanket that smelled of salt and solitude. Elias moved with the stiffness of a man relearning a forgotten language. He opened a metal cabinet and took out a first aid kit, its contents as pristine and orderly as everything else in the lighthouse. His hands, accustomed to the cold grease of gears and the roughness of stone, trembled slightly as he took a piece of cotton. He cleaned the cut on Aurora's forehead with a gentleness that was almost violent in its restraint, as if he were disarming a bomb that could explode at any moment. Every touch was a transgression, a violation of his vow of isolation. He asked no questions. Who she was, where she came from, how she had gotten there, all of that belonged to the world he had left behind. The only words he spoke were short commands, uttered in a low, rusty voice. "Don't move. This might sting." Then he placed a cup of hot tea in her trembling hands. The steam rose, creating a small mist between their faces, a momentary veil. Aurora drank, and the warmth seemed to be the first real thing she had felt in hours. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of two strangers sharing a space that was too small, each painfully aware of the other's breathing. But in that silence, something was happening. In Elias's simple, functional gestures, in the way he tended to her wound without expecting thanks, there was a humanity he thought he had lost. He was caring for a living being, and the act itself was like water on dry earth, cracking open the hardened surface of his soul. Aurora's initial fear began to give way to an exhausted curiosity. She looked around the circular room at the base of the lighthouse. The stone walls, the tools hung in perfect symmetry, the absence of anything personal, anything superfluous. It was a place of pure function, a monastery dedicated to duty. Her gaze settled on the spiral staircase that rose into the darkness. "Is it always like this?" she asked, her voice little more than a whisper, yet it sounded like a scream in the silence. Elias, who was putting away the first aid kit, stopped. The question hung in the air. "Like what?" he replied, without turning. "So quiet, so orderly." He didn't answer right away. What could he say? That the silence was his shield and the order his only sanity? Instead, he murmured, "It's necessary." But her curiosity wasn't intrusive. It was genuine, almost childlike. She wasn't judging him. She was trying to understand the geography of his prison. "And the light?" she continued, gesturing vaguely upward. "It never goes out?" Each question was a stone dropped into the well of his isolation, forcing ripples to the surface. He had to turn. He had to face her. He had to form answers about a life he had deliberately rendered unspoken. The light cannot go out. There are lives at stake. The irony of his own words weighed on him. He, who worried about anonymous lives at sea, had forgotten how to live his own. Aurora's simple questions were disarming him, not with their depth, but with their simplicity. They were forcing him to see his world through someone else's eyes, and the sight was desolate. It was when their eyes truly met that the dynamic shifted. Elias looked at Aurora, not at the wound on her forehead or her soaked clothes, but at what lay behind her gaze. He expected to see fear, and fear was there, but there was something deeper, something he recognized with a clarity that shook him. It was the disorientation of someone ripped from their life, the exhaustion of one who had fought the waves and lost. It was the helplessness of a soul adrift, with no harbor and no direction. And in that recognition, he saw himself. He saw the man he had been 20 years ago, standing on that very beach, staring at an empty sea, feeling the ground dissolve beneath his feet. Her pain was different in form, but its essence was the same. They were both castaways. She from a storm of wind and water, he from a storm of guilt and loss. The empathy that bloomed in that moment was not a choice. It was an involuntary reaction, the resonance between two strings tuned to the same note of suffering. Elias's armor didn't dissolve, it cracked. And through that crack, he felt not pity for her, but a strange, aching camaraderie. She was no longer an intruder. She was a mirror that showed him not the solitary monster he thought he had become, but the wounded man who was still there, buried under layers of silence and routine. And for the first time in 2 decades, Elias did not feel utterly alone. At its peak, the storm severed their last connection to the modern world. With a hum and a crack, the generator gave out. The electric light flickered one last time and died, plunging the lighthouse into a darkness so absolute it seemed to have weight and substance. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind and the waves, as if the universe had been reduced to its most primal form. Without a word, Elias rose and lit a candle, then another. The fragile, dancing flame pushed the darkness into the corners of the room, creating a small circle of warm, intimate light. The shadows it cast on the stone walls were long and dramatic, as if the ghosts of the place had come to sit with them. It was in that makeshift sanctuary, safe from the world outside, that Aurora found her voice. "I was running away," she said, the words spilling out with the force of a contained tide. She wasn't looking at Elias, but at the candle's flame, as if confessing to the fire. Not from the sea, from a man. Her story unfolded in fragments of fear and courage. She spoke of a love that had turned into a cage, of words that cut deeper than glass, of a constant dread that had shrunken her until she had almost disappeared. The boat hadn't been a whim. It had been her final desperate act. She had saved what little money she had, bought a small old boat, and under the cover of night had set out to sea, searching for a freedom she wasn't sure even existed. Her story was not one of weakness, but of terrified strength. The storm that caught her wasn't her enemy. It was just an obstacle in her real battle. Elias listened. He didn't move, didn't interrupt, barely breathed. He who had spent 20 years fleeing the complexity of human pain was now on the front lines, witnessing the anatomy of survival. And in his silence, he offered Aurora something she perhaps hadn't had for a very long time, a safe space for her truth to exist, without judgment, without interruption. Aurora's story hung in the air, weaving itself into the dancing shadows. When she finished, the silence that followed was heavy with meaning. It was her courage that gave Elias permission. Her vulnerability was the key that turned in the rusted lock of his own vault of pain. His gaze drifted to the small wooden boat on the nightstand, softly illuminated by the candle. "I lost someone to the sea too," he said, and his own voice sounded alien to him, like that of a ghost. The words stumbled out, like stones being unearthed after a long burial. "My daughter, her name was Lyra." He spoke of a sunny day, a perfect day, with the sea so calm it looked like a sheet of blue glass. He told of a picnic on the beach, the sound of her laughter mixing with the calls of the gulls. He spoke of how she loved the little wooden boat he had made for her. She was playing at the water's edge, he continued, his eyes fixed on an invisible point in the past. I looked away, just for a second, to put the picnic basket away. The pause that followed was filled with 20 years of guilt. When I looked back, she was gone. The current, a rip current, they said. No one saw her. No one heard her. His voice broke, not with a sob, but with a harsh dryness, the sound of a desert. The sea was calm. There was no struggle. It just took her. It was the first time those words had been spoken aloud, and in speaking them, he gave form to the monster that haunted him. I came to this lighthouse to watch over it, he finally confessed, looking at Aurora, to watch the sea, to never look away again. This is my sentence. Aurora didn't say it wasn't your fault. She knew that guilt doesn't listen to logic. Instead, a single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek, a drop of pure empathy that said more than 1,000 words of comfort. With both truths now laid bare, breathing the same air in the candlelight, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally changed. The tension of the unknown vanished, replaced by a deep, melancholic calm. They were just two human beings, stripped of their armor, their wounds open in the gentle glow of the fire. The silence that settled between them was no longer one of strangeness or discomfort. It was a silent communion, a silence that acknowledged the depth of the other's pain, that respected it, and that refused to profane it with empty words. They needed to say nothing more. Their stories had met, had recognized each other in the dark depths of suffering. He had seen her fight for freedom. She had witnessed his imprisonment by guilt. And in that mutual understanding, a pact was sealed. It was not a pact of friendship or love, but something more fundamental, a covenant of care. A silent agreement that for as long as the storm raged, within that small circle of light, they would guard each other's pain with the same ferocity with which Elias guarded the flame of the lighthouse. They were two castaways who had found, in each other, an unlikely raft. At the very moment their silent communion reached its deepest point, the storm delivered its cruelest blow. A sound unlike any other tore through the night, not the howl of the wind or the crash of the waves, but a dry, violent clap of thunder, so close it vibrated through the granite of the lighthouse. It was followed by a blinding flash that, for a split second, turned the darkness to day, revealing the fury of the sea in terrifying detail. And then came the sound Elias dreaded most, a sharp crack from the top of the tower, followed by silence. A silence not of peace, but of absence. The rotating light, the beating heart of the lighthouse, his sole purpose for 20 years, had gone dark. The darkness that fell was not merely physical. For Elias, it was as if the faint inner sun of his soul had been extinguished. The lighthouse, his very reason for being, was blind. Out there, in the churning waters, anonymous ships now sailed without their guide, vulnerable to the hidden rocks and the fury of the storm. The weight of his responsibility crashed down on him, heavier than any guilt he had ever felt. Before, his pain was personal, a solitary grief. Now, his failure could cost others their lives. He was paralyzed, not by fear, but by the symbolic weight of the moment. The keeper of the light had failed. The darkness outside was now a perfect mirror of the failure within. His sanctuary had become a deadly trap, not just for him, but for the world he had pledged to protect from a distance. The darkness was absolute, and time was running out. It was Aurora's voice that broke him from his paralysis. "What do we do?" she asked, not with panic, but with a startling calm. Her question wasn't an accusation, it was a call to action. "We have to fix it," Elias answered, his voice regaining a trace of its old authority. What followed was a desperate climb up the spiral staircase. Elias led with a handheld flashlight, its batteries weak, casting a wavering beam of light. Aurora followed close behind, carrying a heavy toolbox. The wind howled through the small tower windows, as if trying to tear them from the world. At the top, the lantern room was a chaos of shattered glass and the smell of burnt ozone. The Fresnel lens mechanism, a masterpiece of brass and crystal, was still, and the giant bulb at its center was shattered. The repair was a Herculean task, nearly impossible in these conditions. Elias, who had always worked alone, relying only on his own strength and knowledge, found himself helpless. His hand trembled too much to fit the small nut on the bolt. The flashlight wouldn't illuminate the right angle. He needed more than two hands. "Hold this," he ordered Aurora, pointing to the flashlight. She complied immediately, holding the beam of light with a steadiness that surprised him. "Now, pass me the smallest screwdriver." Their teamwork wasn't graceful. It was clumsy, urgent, fueled by adrenaline. Their hands brushed as she passed him a tool. An accidental touch, but it sent a shock of warmth and humanity through the cold metal. He, the man who had walled himself off from human contact, was now depending on it to fulfill his most sacred duty. They were no longer the keeper and the castaway. They were a team, a four-handed, two-hearted organism fighting against the darkness, united by a common purpose that transcended their individual pains. Time seemed to warp. Minutes stretched into hours, each second marked by the sound of metal on metal and the relentless roar of the storm. Sweat mingled with the rain that seeped in through the cracks. Finally, with one last turn and a satisfying click, the backup bulb was in place and the mechanism was repaired. "Stand back," Elias said, his voice tense with anticipation. He pulled a heavy lever. There was a hum, a groaning protest from the old gears as they awoke, and then a glow. The light returned, first as an incandescent filament, then exploding into a dazzling glory that filled the room and drove the darkness away. The Fresnel lenses caught that light, focused it, and cast it out in a powerful, steady beam. The mechanism began to rotate, slow and majestic, and the great eye of the lighthouse once again began its sweep of the sea. Elias and Aurora stood, breathless, bathed in that reborn light. It wasn't just the lighthouse's beam that had returned, it was something more. As it lit up the sea outside, the light also illuminated them from within. In that moment, Elias understood. He hadn't just fixed a machine. By working with Aurora, by trusting her, by allowing her presence to aid him, he had mended something inside himself. The light that now spun was not just a sign of hope for lost ships, it was a symbol of his own rebirth. Hope was not something you found, it was something you built, sometimes with another's hands. The light had returned, stronger and more meaningful than ever, and the darkness, both within and without, had been defeated. The dawn arrived not as an explosion of color, but as a whisper. The storm's fury had spent itself overnight, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and weary. The wind was now a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. The sky, a pale, pearlescent gray, promised the sun's arrival. And the sea, once a monster of black peaks, was now a calm, rippling mirror, reflecting the new light with an almost reverent quiet. Aurora stood at the door of the lighthouse, dressed in Elias's dry clothes, which were much too large for her, looking both fragile and remarkably resilient. On the shore, a small fishing boat that had come to check the storm's damage waited for her, a dark silhouette against the silver water. The time for her to leave had come. The farewell was as silent as their meeting had been. There were no hugs, no promises to see each other again. What they had shared that night, the confessions, the struggle against the darkness, the rebirth of the light, was too sacred to be tarnished by the platitudes of the outside world. Words were unnecessary. Gratitude was etched in their gazes. "Thank you, Elias," Aurora said, her voice clear in the morning quiet, "for everything." He simply nodded, unable to form a response that could do justice to what he felt. She hadn't only brought him safety, she had brought him back to himself. As she walked across the slick rocks toward the boat, he didn't feel the return of his old loneliness. The silence that now surrounded him was no longer one of emptiness, but of peace. It was a silence filled with the memory of her presence, with the certainty that human connection was possible, even after 20 years of exile. He watched the boat move away until it was a dot on the horizon, not with a sense of loss, but with serene gratitude. She had been the storm he needed for his soul to find its calm. After the boat disappeared, Elias did not return to his routine. Instead, he did something he hadn't done by choice in years. He slowly climbed the spiral staircase, not from duty, but from desire. At the top, in the lantern room now bathed in soft morning light, he looked out. It was the same horizon he had obsessively watched for 2 decades, the same stretch of water, the same sky. But everything was different. The sea was no longer the thief that had stolen his daughter. It was no longer his enemy, his executioner. For the first time in 20 years, he saw the sea for what it was, vast, beautiful, indifferent, and yet pulsating with life. He saw the colors shifting with the light, the sun's glare dancing on the waves, the distant line where the blue met the sky. His perspective had shifted. The sea was no longer Lyra's grave. It was simply the sea. And he was a part of it, not as a prisoner, but as a guardian. Silent tears began to roll down his face, but these were not the bitter tears of guilt. They were tears of liberation. He was crying for his daughter, yes, but not for her loss. He was crying for the beauty of her memory, which could now finally exist in peace, freed from the weight of his anger. And then, something that seemed impossible happened. The corners of his mouth, set firm by years of sorrow, turned upward. A smile. It was not wide or loud, but it was genuine. A faint smile, born from a place of deep acceptance. He was smiling at the horizon, at the promise of a new day, at a life that, despite everything, goes on. His wound had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. It had become part of a larger landscape, one that now included the possibility of peace. The final scene is not one of drastic change, but of subtle transformation. We see Elias, weeks later, going about his duties. He still oils the gears, still polishes the brass. The routine is the same, but the man is different. His movements are no longer mechanical and obsessive. They are fluid, done with a care that feels like affection. He is not fighting chaos. He is tending to his home. He talks to the gulls, his voice no longer a rusty whisper. Sometimes he hums softly to himself, an old tune his memory has unearthed. On his nightstand, the small wooden boat is no longer alone. Beside it rests a tiny, iridescent shell left behind by Aurora. The 2 objects, one representing the memory of the past and the other the promise of the future, coexist in harmony. He is no longer in hiding. He climbs to the top of the lighthouse every day, not to watch the sea in anger, but to feel the wind on his face and to observe the world's beauty. He is no longer a prisoner of the light. He has become its source. His purpose is no longer a penance, but a calling. He is a light that not only guides the ships, but also illuminates his own path. The story ends with an image of him at the top of the tower at sunset, gazing not toward the past, but out at the horizon. He is alone, but he is not lonely. He is the keeper, yes, but now he is also the lighthouse, a testament that even after the longest night and the fiercest storm, the light can and will always return. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can be lighthouses for one another.